At first light, before a castle town had fully stirred, the world of feudal Japan could seem almost impossibly ordered. Rooflines sat in careful layers beneath the hills. Wooden gates marked status as much as protection. Servants moved quietly. Messengers hurried. Rice was measured. Names were recorded. And somewhere behind walls of plaster and timber, someone with a sword was already being watched by someone else. From a distance, that world is often reduced to a handful of familiar images. A samurai with perfect discipline. A ninja in black slipping through the dark. A geisha moving like a symbol of refined beauty. Peasants bowed into silence. Lords ruled by absolute command. Everything appears elegant, hierarchical, and strangely still, as though feudal Japan existed in one long, unbroken pose. But the closer we look, the less that picture holds. Many of the most famous stereotypes about feudal Japan contain a fragment of truth, yet only a fragment. They survive because they are memorable, and because they compress centuries of social life into a few powerful symbols. What they leave out is the part that makes the period most interesting. Why these images emerged, what daily reality felt like beneath them, and how often the image and the lived experience were not quite the same thing at all. To understand feudal Japan properly, it helps to begin not with a myth, but with a structure. This was not a single moment in time, and it was not one frozen culture. The long feudal age, especially from the late medieval period into the Tokugawa era, was shaped by war, regional rivalry, administrative innovation, economic growth, and prolonged attempts to impose social stability on a society that had known instability very well. The stereotypes were not created in a vacuum. They were products of political need, theater, literature, later nostalgia, and, in some cases, foreign fascination. That is why a world that now looks so clean and symbolic was, in practice, crowded with compromise. Take the most enduring stereotype of all. The samurai as the noble warrior, living by an unbreakable code, always ready to die with serene devotion. It is one of the most influential images in global history, and not without reason. Samurai did exist as a warrior elite. They did serve lords. They did prize loyalty, reputation, skill, and honor. But the modern version of the samurai has been polished by later storytelling until it becomes almost weightless, as if the reality were made only of steel and principle. The historical samurai lived inside systems, and systems produce less romantic behavior than legend usually allows. In the long centuries of conflict, especially during the Sengoku period, samurai could be practical, opportunistic, ambitious, and deeply concerned with survival. They changed allegiances. They negotiated. They managed estates. They handled logistics. They worried about stipends, family status, inheritance, and service. They were not simply duelists waiting for a dramatic moral test. Many were administrators as much as fighters, and in peacetime that mattered more and more. This is where a first assumption begins to soften. The stereotype imagines the samurai at his most heroic, but much of samurai history was not spent in cinematic combat. It was spent in service, paperwork, household management, debt, politics, and ritualized display. In the Tokugawa period, when relative peace lasted for more than 2 centuries, the warrior class remained socially elevated, yet many samurai had fewer chances to act as warriors in any literal sense. They became bureaucrats, scholars, guards, domain officials, teachers, and men expected to preserve martial dignity in an age that often required ink more than blood. That tension mattered. A class defined by war had to justify itself in peace. One result was a growing emphasis on ideals. Ethical writing, family codes, and later formulations of Bushido helped explain what samurai ought to be. That did not mean every samurai always lived that way. In fact, the insistence on virtue often tells us that the gap between ideal and reality was large enough to require repeated attention. The more a society writes about proper conduct, the more we should suspect conduct itself was uneven. Honor was real, but so were corruption, boredom, financial stress, vanity, and fear. Even seppuku, perhaps the most dramatic ritual associated with samurai life, sits awkwardly between stereotype and history. It did exist, and it carried intense symbolic meaning connected to responsibility, shame, protest, punishment, and loyalty. Yet the modern imagination often treats it as if it were a constant feature of samurai existence, almost routine. It was not. It was exceptional, formal, and heavily shaped by circumstance. Its lasting fame owes much to later fascination with its starkness. For contemporaries, it was not a theatrical flourish detached from life. It was a severe act within a world of status, discipline, and public consequence. And then there is the sword. No object has done more to define feudal Japan in the modern imagination than the katana. It appears as the perfect weapon, almost a spiritual extension of the warrior, superior in all things and carried through history with mystical inevitability. Yet here again, the stereotype grows out of truth while drifting away from proportion. Japanese swords were remarkable works of craftsmanship, but the sword's symbolic status expanded over time. On battlefields, bows, spears, firearms, terrain, formation, timing, and supply often mattered more than individual swordsmanship. The sword was never irrelevant, but neither was it the sole center of military reality. This is one of the quiet reversals that makes the era more human. A society remembered for the sword was often governed by much less glamorous tools. Ledgers, rice assessments, land surveys, hostage arrangements, marriage alliances, road checkpoints, and rules about clothing. Feudal power was not maintained by dramatic combat alone. It was sustained by administration. That, in turn, begins to change how we see the lordly world surrounding the samurai. The stereotype of the daimyo is usually simple, a commanding warlord seated above absolute obedience. Yet real daimyo power was both immense and constrained. A lord ruled through retainers who had their own ambitions, through households full of rank dependence, through obligations to higher authorities, and, in the Tokugawa system, through regulations designed precisely to keep major lords from becoming too independent. Alternate attendance, for example, required many daimyo to spend substantial time in Edo and leave family there, which was both a political strategy and a financial burden. Prestige was compulsory and expensive. That expense mattered more than the stereotype suggests. A daimyo was not merely a man of authority. He was also a manager of image. Castles, processions, residence requirements, ceremonial obligations, and the maintenance of proper household order all consumed resources. Underneath the appearance of hierarchy, there was constant accounting. Domains varied widely in wealth and resilience. A noble exterior could conceal serious fiscal strain. If you enjoy this slower kind of historical storytelling, there is plenty more of it here, told in the same calm and careful way. The same pattern appears when we move downward through society. One of the most persistent assumptions about feudal Japan is that common people existed in static submission beneath the warrior elite, voiceless and immobile. There is truth in the hierarchy. Status distinctions were real, and they could shape marriage, labor, dress, housing, taxation, and punishment. But common life was not empty of agency. Villages negotiated collectively, households strategized, merchants accumulated wealth, artisans developed urban cultures, and peasants sometimes protested, petitioned, fled, or adapted with considerable ingenuity. In fact, one of the most misleading stereotypes about feudal societies in general is that power moved only downward. In practice, rulers depended on the governed for revenue, labor, information, and basic cooperation. A village could not simply be imagined as a mass of passive bodies. It was a functioning community with internal leadership, local memory, and practical leverage. Tax burdens could be severe, crop failures devastating, and punishments harsh, but daily life still required negotiation. Rural people knew the land more intimately than officials did. They understood weather, irrigation, seasonal labor, and the narrow margins on which survival depended. Once we notice that the old picture of feudal Japan as a silent pyramid becomes harder to sustain. The merchant, too, troubles the stereotype. In formal Neo-Confucian ranking, merchants often stood below peasants because they profited from exchange rather than production. Yet in many urban settings, especially during the Tokugawa era, merchants became economically powerful and culturally influential. The official ranking system survived, but money moved in ways rank could not fully contain. Wealthy townspeople sponsored arts, shaped consumption, extended credit, and sometimes lived with a degree of practical influence that sat awkwardly beside their supposed inferiority. This is one of the deeper ironies of feudal Japan. The society spoke in the language of fixed order, but daily life kept producing movement inside that order. Samurai could be cash-poor and status-rich. Merchants could be status-poor and cash-rich. Peasants might appear low in rank while occupying an indispensable position in the moral economy of production. The stereotype gives us a ladder. The reality was more like a structure under tension, always insisting on stability while quietly negotiating change. And then there is the famous matter of discipline, the idea that feudal Japan was uniformly austere, restrained, and emotionally contained. Certainly, formal behavior mattered. Etiquette could be elaborate. Households were governed by rank and propriety. Public conduct had weight. But this should not mislead us into imagining a society without pleasure, humor, appetite, gossip, vanity, or spectacle. Castle towns and growing cities were full of entertainment, fashion, consumption, and social performance. People pursued status not only through service and duty, but through display, taste, literary knowledge, and cultivated refinement. A world of rules often generates a world of subtle indulgence. So even before we reach the better-known stereotypes of ninja, geisha, and the supposed total isolation of the country, a clearer pattern has begun to emerge. The popular image of feudal Japan is not completely false. It is simply too neat. It prefers symbols over systems, ideals over compromises, and costumes over constraints. It remembers the sword and forgets the stipend. It remembers obedience and forgets negotiation. It remembers the hierarchy and forgets the friction inside it. The more carefully we listen to the period, the more its people step out from behind the lacquered surface. They become less iconic and more intelligible. The samurai starts to look not only like a warrior, but like a salaried retainer under pressure. The lord looks not only powerful, but burdened by display and surveillance. The peasant looks not only subordinate, but necessary, observant, and strategic. The merchant looks not like a marginal figure, but like part of the quiet reshaping of the social order. And this matters because stereotypes do more than simplify the past. They also decide in advance which people get to seem fully human. Feudal Japan has often been admired from afar precisely because it appears so composed. Yet composure itself can hide a great deal. Anxiety about status, uncertainty about loyalty, the practical nuisance of administration, the exhaustion of maintaining appearances, the endless negotiations of households, villages, and domain governments. A polished surface is not the same thing as a simple reality. That becomes even clearer when we turn to the figures who occupy perhaps the most distorted place in the modern imagination. Because if the samurai has been romanticized, the ninja has been almost entirely remade, and behind that black-clad silhouette lies a much stranger story than the stereotype usually allows. Because if the samurai has been romanticized, the ninja has been almost entirely remade, and behind that black-clad silhouette lies a much stranger story than the stereotype usually allows. The modern ninja arrives already dressed by theater, comic books, cinema, and video games. He moves alone, always at night, dressed in fitted black, carrying an arsenal of ingenious tools, vanishing in smoke, and existing as the absolute opposite of the samurai. Hidden rather than visible, cunning rather than honorable, invisible where the warrior is ceremonial. It is one of the most recognizable images associated with Japan anywhere in the world, and also one of the least reliable if taken too literally. There were certainly specialists in espionage, reconnaissance, infiltration, sabotage, and irregular warfare. States at war needed information, and warlords valued men who could gather it, carry messages, assess defenses, start fires, spread confusion, or move in ways conventional soldiers could not. In long periods of military rivalry, intelligence mattered immensely. Armies did not simply collide in noble openness. They watched one another, bribed informants, exploited local knowledge, and sought advantage wherever it could be found. In that sense, the fantasy grows from a real foundation. But the historical shinobi was not usually a supernatural shadow in a perfect costume. Much of the time, the most effective infiltrator was the person who did not look unusual at all. This is one of those places where the stereotype becomes almost inverted. Popular culture imagines concealment through a distinctive identity, while real concealment often depended on blending into ordinary life. A spy might pass as a laborer, monk, traveler, servant, merchant, or entertainer. He might rely more on patience and observation than combat. He might never draw a weapon. He might not even be a permanent professional in the way later stories suggest. Skills associated with shinobi activity existed within broader networks of military service, local knowledge, and opportunistic wartime practice. Even the famous black outfit needs careful handling. What most people picture as ninja clothing owes much to stage conventions. In Japanese theater, stagehands dressed in black were treated as conventionally invisible to the audience, and over time this visual logic influenced representations of stealth. It is elegant as a theatrical device, but reality is less obliging. Someone moving through moonlight, torchlight, or open terrain in pure black could be easier to notice than a person dressed in muted ordinary fabrics suited to local conditions. And here again the truth becomes more interesting once the image is stripped away. The shinobi stereotype survives because it offers a clean contrast. Samurai above ground, ninja below it. One honorable, one deceptive. Yet the actual world of feudal warfare was not organized around such pure opposites. Samurai commanders used surprise, deception, ambush, and intelligence when needed. Irregular methods were not alien to warfare. They were part of it. The moral language surrounding war could be lofty, but the practice of war was usually practical. This is worth lingering over because it tells us something larger about feudal Japan. The stereotypes are often arranged like dramatic roles, as if society itself were a stage of clear symbolic types. But people living inside unstable political conditions did not have the luxury of existing as symbols. They responded to danger with whatever methods worked. The image of perfect codes and perfect oppositions belongs more to later interpretation than to the shifting pressures of life at the time. Certain regions, especially Iga and Koga, became famous in later memory for associations with shinobi practices, and those reputations were not invented from nothing. Mountainous terrain, local autonomy, martial organization, and experience in conflict all contributed to the reputational landscape from which later stories drew. But by the time popular imagination had finished with them, local military expertise had been transformed into something much closer to legend. Manuals circulated, tales accumulated. The line between practical instruction and embellished mystique grew thin. That process in itself is historically revealing. People do not create legends at random. The ninja became compelling because hidden power is always compelling. In a world so marked by rank and display, the thought that someone obscure could move underneath the visible order held a special fascination. Feudal Japan projected hierarchy in everything from architecture to clothing, so the idea of secret skill operating below that hierarchy was bound to gather imaginative force. The same was true, though in a very different register, of another figure badly misunderstood in modern retellings: the geisha. To many viewers outside Japan, the word has long been confused with a vague idea of feminine elegance, erotic mystery, or ornamental submission. Sometimes the geisha is merged carelessly with the courtesan. Sometimes she becomes a decorative symbol, less a person than a drifting arrangement of silk, white makeup, and trained gestures. The stereotype is persistent because it is visually powerful, and because it flatters an outsider's appetite for refinement without requiring much understanding. But as so often happens, the real institution was far more structured, more professional, and more socially specific than the stereotype allows. A geisha was, in the broadest and most accurate sense, a trained entertainer. Her world was one of music, conversation, timing, literary awareness, social intelligence, and performance. She might sing, dance, play the shamisen, host gatherings, and help create an atmosphere in which elite or affluent male clients could enjoy cultivated company. This was not an informal role. It required discipline, apprenticeship, memory, composure, and technique. The polished ease associated with geisha life was itself the product of labor. That is often the hidden truth beneath the stereotype of elegance. What looks effortless is usually heavily constructed. In the urban pleasure quarters and entertainment districts of the Tokugawa world, categories mattered. Courtesans, especially the high-ranking ones, occupied a different role from geisha, though in foreign imagination the distinction was often blurred or ignored. Courtesans were associated more directly with the licensed sex trade, with elaborate systems of ranking, display, and controlled access. Geisha emerged in relation to entertainment and artistic sociability, even though the worlds could overlap socially and geographically. Conflating the two erases not only an institutional distinction but also the forms of skilled cultural labor that gave geisha their place. This distinction matters for another reason as well. It reveals how easily feudal Japan is viewed through an exoticizing lens, as though all refined femininity in the period existed for uncomplicated male fantasy. In reality, the entertainment world was commercial, disciplined, competitive, and governed by rules. Women within it could possess considerable cultural capital and practical intelligence, though always within structures shaped by gender inequality, economic dependence, and limited freedom. To romanticize that world is misleading. To reduce it to simple exploitation is also incomplete. It was both constrained and skilled, decorative and demanding, celebrated and controlled. That duality runs through much of feudal Japanese life. The more formal and beautiful the surface, the more important it becomes to ask what work sustained it. The stereotype of women more generally in feudal Japan also tends to collapse a wide range of realities into a single submissive image. Certainly, patriarchal structures were powerful. Household hierarchy mattered. Inheritance patterns, marriage politics, and legal expectations often favored male authority. But women's lives varied sharply by class, region, household, and period. Elite women could serve as political intermediaries, managers of households, guardians of lineage interests, or strategic brides in alliance-making. Rural women labored intensely in agriculture and household production. Urban women participated in commerce, craft work, and family enterprise. Some women became noted writers, artists, religious figures, or managers of property under specific conditions. None of this erases inequality. It simply reminds us that inequality does not produce identical lives. And that brings us to another widely repeated stereotype, that feudal Japan was sealed off from the world, entirely isolated, closed in spirit as well as policy, untouched by external influence until it was suddenly forced open in the 19th century. This story is common because it is neat. It gives the country a dramatic before and after, a long sleep and a jolt of awakening. But like most neat stories, it simplifies a more uneven reality. The Tokugawa shogunate did impose major restrictions on foreign contact, especially from the 17th century onward. Christianity was harshly suppressed. Overseas travel by Japanese subjects was limited. Trade was controlled through a narrow set of approved channels. Foreign influence, especially when linked to religion or political destabilization, was treated with suspicion. In that sense, the image of a guarded polity is not imaginary. Yet closed is too absolute a word. Trade continued through carefully managed routes. The Dutch remained at Dejima in Nagasaki under strict regulation. Chinese merchants were active there as well. Korea and the Ryukyu Kingdom were part of significant diplomatic and commercial relationships, though not always in ways modern viewers easily recognize. Knowledge moved through books, objects, medicine, astronomy, and technical observation. Rangaku, or Dutch learning, became one of the channels through which European science and practical knowledge entered Japan in selective form. The country was restricted, watched, and filtered, but not hermetically sealed. This is another quiet reversal. A political order determined to control outside contact still depended on contact enough to monitor, use, and interpret it. Isolation, in practice, was management, and management is perhaps the best word for the Tokugawa order as a whole. When people imagine feudal Japan, they often picture endless sword-bearing drama, but the great achievement of the Tokugawa state was not perpetual war. It was durable control after war. Roads were monitored. Domains were balanced against one another. Social categories were formalized. Mobility was regulated. Violence, though never absent, was disciplined into a wider political settlement. The peace was real, but it was not the peace of looseness. It was the peace of supervision, which is why the stereotype of serene traditional life can be so deceptive. Peace sounds restful from a distance. Up close, it often meant surveillance, financial pressure, protocol, and the constant maintenance of order. A daimyo traveling in procession to Edo projected grandeur, but that grandeur was compulsory. A samurai wearing 2 swords projected status, but that status could conceal debt. A village paying taxes into a stable system still lived under the vulnerability of weather, harvest, and official demand. A merchant prospering in the city still moved through a moral vocabulary that ranked him below many poorer men. The apparent stillness of feudal Japan was built on motion. Goods moving, officials recording, households adjusting, ranks being performed, obligations being renewed. That is one reason urban life became so culturally rich. Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto were not static museums of hierarchy. They were dense and active human environments. Edo in particular grew into one of the largest cities in the world, filled with samurai residences, artisan neighborhoods, merchant houses, theaters, booksellers, bathhouses, food stalls, and all the ordinary noise that stereotypes tend to suppress. This was not merely a warrior civilization. It was also an urban civilization, and one increasingly shaped by consumption, literacy, fashion, and popular culture. Print culture matters here more than it first appears. The spread of commercially produced books, guidebooks, illustrated works, and popular literature helped create a society in which images of itself could circulate with unusual force. In other words, feudal Japan began producing some of its own stereotypes while it was still feudal. Actors, beauties, famous places, warriors, ghosts, loyal retainers, and stylish urban types all entered a shared visual world. The past was being narrated, polished, moralized, and commodified even before later nationalism and foreign fascination added their own layers. So when modern audiences inherit an image of feudal Japan, they are not receiving a simple historical memory. They are receiving a long chain of selective representations, some domestic, some foreign, some nostalgic, some commercial, some political. The stereotype is not merely false information. It is an accumulation of storytelling. That is especially clear in the case of Bushido itself. Modern people often speak of Bushido as though it were a single ancient code followed uniformly across centuries by all samurai. Yet the very idea was codified and interpreted in changing ways. Values such as loyalty, courage, frugality, and self-control were certainly associated with warrior ideals, but the later presentation of Bushido as a coherent timeless creed owes much to peacetime reflection, moral writing, and later still modern national reworking. What seems ancient and fixed is often partly retrospective. This does not make it unreal. It makes it historical. The distinction is important. Historical societies are always explaining themselves to themselves. They build ideals after crises. They polish traditions in periods of transition. They claim permanence precisely when change is most unsettling. Feudal Japan was no exception. A world born out of centuries of conflict eventually became skilled at presenting itself as ordered, proper, and morally legible. The stereotypes that survive today are, in some sense, descendants of that presentation. But the descendants are cleaner than the original. And perhaps nowhere is that cleaner image more visible than in the way castles, armor, and warrior splendor dominate the memory of the age, as though ordinary domestic life were only a background curtain behind heroic display. Yet once we step through the gates and into the rooms where people actually ate, slept, accounted, worried, and negotiated marriage, inheritance, and service, the texture changes again. The grand symbols remain, but they begin to rest on floorboards worn by much less dramatic human routines, and it is there, inside the household itself, that several of the most stubborn stereotypes start to come apart even further. And it is there, inside the household itself, that several of the most stubborn stereotypes start to come apart even further. From a distance, feudal Japan is often imagined through public scenes. A lord in procession, a samurai in armor, a geisha in a lantern-lit room, a castle rising above stone foundations. These are the images that travel most easily. But most people, even in a highly stratified world, did not live their lives in public spectacle. They lived them in rooms that had to be swept, in storehouses that had to be checked, in kitchens where rice had to stretch far enough, in family arrangements that could hold together or quietly fail under pressure. And once the camera of the mind moves indoors, the age begins to look less like a series of symbols and more like a collection of daily negotiations. The household was not simply a private refuge from politics. In feudal Japan, it was one of the basic units through which politics, status, labor, and inheritance were made real. The Japanese i.e., often translated loosely as household or house, was not merely a family in the emotional modern sense. It was a continuing social unit tied to property, name, duty, succession, and reputation. It included not only blood relatives, but, depending on class and context, retainers, servants, adopted heirs, branch relations, and people whose place in the structure was practical before it was sentimental. The goal was continuity. A household was expected to endure beyond the wishes of any one person inside it. That alone already unsettles a common stereotype. Modern viewers often imagine feudal Japan as a world of rigid individuals, each person trapped in a fixed rank and performing a predetermined role. But much of the system actually depended on flexibility within form. Adoption, for example, was not a marginal detail. It could be central to preserving the household line. A family without a suitable male heir might adopt one, sometimes even an adult. Marriages could be arranged not only for companionship or alliance, but for continuity, financial necessity, or status management. In other words, a world famous for hierarchy was often remarkably pragmatic when that hierarchy needed to survive. That pragmatism could be cold, of course. Continuity was not always kind. It might require the sacrifice of personal preference, emotional closeness, or individual ambition. But it is worth noticing that the stereotype of unchanging bloodline purity gives way, on closer inspection, to a more adaptable logic. What mattered was not abstract romance or even simple biological descent. What mattered was whether the house could continue. For samurai families, this pressure could be intense. Status had to be maintained, service obligations met, and proper conduct observed. Yet many samurai households lived under financial constraints that modern romantic imagery almost never acknowledges. The two swords might remain at the waist, but the purse could be quite thin. Stipends, usually paid in rice or measured in terms connected to rice, did not always keep pace with rising costs in an increasingly monetized economy. A warrior family expected to preserve dignity could find itself pawning possessions, reducing household expenses, taking on side work unofficially, or marrying with financial calculation very much in mind. This is one of the least cinematic but most revealing truths about feudal Japan. Dignity was expensive. A samurai was expected to look like a samurai. Clothing, bearing, household arrangement, literacy, and ceremonial propriety all helped sustain the visible order of status. Yet many lower-ranking samurai struggled to finance the life they were expected to embody. The contrast could be severe. A man might carry a sword that symbolized inherited honor while borrowing money from a merchant whom official ideology ranked beneath him. That inversion sits quietly at the center of the Tokugawa order. Rank and resources no longer aligned as neatly as the formal hierarchy pretended they did. Inside the home, this misalignment produced practical consequences. Household women often managed economies of scarcity with far more intelligence and discipline than later romantic depictions admit. Budgets had to be balanced, clothing maintained, food allocated, gifts prepared, servants supervised if servants existed at all, and children trained for a future that might be socially dignified yet materially uncertain. The ideal of masculine warrior honor has dominated memory so strongly that it can obscure the extent to which everyday survival depended on careful domestic administration. And the domestic sphere itself was not soft in the modern sentimental sense. It was structured, laborious, and morally loaded. Cleanliness mattered. Manners mattered. Seasonal awareness mattered. The arrangement of rooms, the use of screens, the storage of bedding, the management of fire risk, the receiving of guests, the display or concealment of objects according to occasion. All of this belonged to a world in which order was both practical and symbolic. A household could be judged by the discipline with which it presented itself. Yet this too should not be over-romanticized into a vision of minimalist serenity. The modern stereotype of the Japanese interior as a pure space of tranquil emptiness often reflects later aesthetic selection more than universal daily reality. Houses were vulnerable to fire, damp, cold, and wear. Materials were organic and perishable. Smoke, insects, drafts, and seasonal discomfort were ordinary facts of life. Even refined interiors required maintenance against conditions that were far less gentle than the image suggests. Winter, especially, reminds us how much the elegant picture can mislead. The stereotype of traditional Japanese domestic life often implies a continuous comfort built out of tatami, wood, paper, and subdued beauty. In reality, many homes were cold. Insulation was limited by design and material. Heating was local rather than evenly distributed. Charcoal braziers, layered clothing, bedding, and strategic use of space mattered enormously. The architecture we now admire for its openness and subtlety could also be drafty and difficult in harsh weather. What later appears serene may, in lived experience, have required endurance. That is another recurring pattern in this world. Beauty often coexisted with inconvenience. Refinement did not cancel discomfort. It organized it. The same could be said of food. Modern stereotypes about Japanese history sometimes drift toward two opposite distortions. One imagines a timeless perfection of healthy restraint, as if everyone ate simple, balanced meals with quiet satisfaction. The other imagines peasants living almost perpetually on the edge of starvation while elites feasted in stylized abundance. Both contain pieces of truth, and both are incomplete. Rice was central not only nutritionally and culturally, but politically. It was a staple, a tax basis, a status marker, and a unit of assessment. But not everyone ate polished white rice all the time, and the quality and variety of food depended heavily on class, region, season, and fortune. Commoners might rely on mixed grains, millet, barley, vegetables, pickles, miso, and whatever local conditions allowed. Fish mattered in many diets, though access varied. Urban food culture could become sophisticated, even playful, with stalls, specialized dishes, and regional tastes. Elite dining could emphasize presentation and sequence as much as quantity. Yet scarcity, crop failure, and price shocks remained recurring threats. Even here, in something as basic as a meal, the stereotype of a static civilization gives way to movement. Diets changed over time. Cities created new forms of consumption. Commercial networks expanded availability. Taste itself became part of urban identity. What people ate and how they talked about it tells us that feudal Japan was not suspended outside history. It evolved internally, sometimes quite quickly. Bathing offers another small but revealing example. Japanese bathing culture has often been folded into a broad stereotype of timeless refinement and ritual cleanliness. Certainly, bathing had great social and practical importance. Public baths became major features of urban life. Washing, soaking, and the management of bodily comfort mattered in distinctive ways. But here again, the charming image should not erase the material context. Heating water required fuel. Access varied. Public baths could be crowded, noisy, and socially mixed depending on period and place. They were not simply meditative scenes preserved for aesthetic appreciation. They were part of the ordinary infrastructure of living bodies in dense settlements. The more closely one looks, the harder it becomes to keep feudal Japan in the realm of decorative fantasy. The people of the age had sore feet, worries about money, quarrels over inheritance, annoyance with officials, anxieties over appearances, and all the other frictions that enter human life wherever status and survival meet. The stereotype survives by sanding those rough edges away. Children, too, are often missing from the stereotype unless they appear as miniature adults in formal clothing. Yet childhood in feudal Japan was shaped by labor, training, expectation, and vulnerability. A child's future depended heavily on household position and local conditions. In peasant families, children contributed early to work appropriate to their age and sex. In artisan or merchant households, they might be folded into apprenticeship-like routines. In samurai homes, education, etiquette, calligraphy, and moral instruction could play major roles, though not always in a gentle atmosphere. Mortality remained an ever-present fact. Illness, accident, and famine did not spare the young simply because later paintings can make the world look composed. Education itself complicates another easy assumption. Feudal Japan is often pictured as militarized and ceremonial, but by the Tokugawa period literacy rates in some areas were strikingly substantial by early modern standards, especially in towns. Temple schools, domain schools, private academies, and household instruction all contributed to a culture in which reading, writing, calculation, and practical learning had real presence. This did not create equality of knowledge, and education differed widely by class and gender, but it did mean that the society was intellectually busier than the stereotype of rigid feudal backwardness suggests. That matters because literacy changes the texture of daily life. It creates records, letters, manuals, contracts, notices, circulating stories, and new forms of aspiration. A merchant who can keep accounts effectively, a village headman who can navigate official documentation, a samurai who studies history and ethics, a townsman who reads popular fiction. These are not incidental details. They are signs of a social world thinking about itself in increasingly layered ways. And with literacy came aspiration, imitation, and anxiety. People watched one another. They borrowed styles upward and downward. Sumptuary regulations attempted to limit excess or preserve status distinctions, but such rules exist precisely because imitation was happening. Merchants purchased luxuries. Townspeople developed tastes once reserved for higher ranks. Fashion became an argument conducted in cloth, hairstyle, and small details of domestic display. Even restraint could become a style. So the old image of fixed classes sitting motionless in their proper boxes continues to weaken. The order remained real, but it was continually being negotiated through appearance. A society with firm status lines could still be obsessed with subtle social movement. In fact, that obsession may have been stronger because the lines were there. This is especially visible in cities, where proximity made comparison unavoidable. Edo was full of samurai, but not all samurai were equal. Great lords and their entourages lived alongside lower-ranking retainers whose lives were much narrower. Merchants rose in wealth while warriors struggled with debt. Artisans supplied the material world that made status visible. Servants watched their masters. Clients watched patrons. Neighbors watched neighbors. The result was not simply hierarchy, but performance under observation. And performance can be tiring. That fatigue, though rarely celebrated in popular imagery, is one of the emotional truths of feudal Japan. To live in a highly codified society is to spend a great deal of energy on appropriateness. One must know how to bow, when to speak, what to wear, what to write, how to host, how to serve, how to refuse, how to yield, how to conceal embarrassment, how to preserve the household name, how to endure insult without destabilizing the larger order. The stereotype sees grace. The lived experience often included strain. This does not mean the age was uniquely oppressive by historical standards. Every complex society imposes forms. But feudal Japan has been remembered in such intensely aesthetic terms that the strain inside those forms can disappear from view. The tea utensil is remembered more easily than the debt ledger. The screen painting more easily than the cold room. The armor more easily than the family argument over succession. And yet it was precisely these smaller, quieter matters that determined so much of ordinary existence. Nowhere was that more true than in the countryside, where the stereotype of the peasant as a bowed, anonymous rice grower still lingers stubbornly. Rural life certainly involved grueling labor and subjection to taxation. But villages were not merely fields with human attachments. They were governed communities with customs, obligations, internal hierarchies, and shared risks. Households differed in landholding, labor power, resilience, and local standing. Some peasants were relatively secure. Others hovered much closer to disaster. Headmen mediated with authorities. Collective responsibility shaped village life. Irrigation, boundaries, woodland use, roads, and seasonal labor all required coordination. This means the countryside was never just a passive backdrop to samurai history. It was the material base of the entire order. Rice assessments, village records, cadastral surveys, and tax extraction linked local labor directly to elite power. Without rural production, the grandeur of the castle town could not exist. Without peasant compliance, adaptation, or at least endurance, the political order would have been far harder to sustain. And this in turn explains why peasant protest, flight, petition, and evasion mattered so much when they occurred. A stereotype of total submission cannot account for the amount of effort rulers devoted to measuring, monitoring, and managing the rural world. States do not watch powerless people so closely unless those people are, in some sense, indispensable. The contradiction deepens further when we remember that many village communities preserved their own internal memories and practical intelligence over generations. Officials might arrive with mandates, but local people knew which embankments failed first, which families were weakened by debt, which years had seen bad weather, which routes could be used when roads became impassable. That kind of knowledge was not glamorous, but it was power of a quiet kind. By this point, a broader pattern is becoming unmistakable. The stereotypes of feudal Japan survive because they offer clear shapes: samurai, ninja, geisha, peasant, lord. But the real world underneath those shapes was made of institutions, seasonal rhythms, money troubles, family strategies, selective adaptation, and a great many human improvisations. The age was formal, yes, but never simple. It was disciplined, but not still. It was hierarchical, but full of tensions within hierarchy. And as the Tokugawa centuries went on, those tensions did not fade. In some respects, they grew sharper. Peace created prosperity in some places, but it also created imbalance. Urban culture flourished, but moralists worried. Merchants expanded influence, but official ideology lagged behind economic reality. Samurai remained privileged, but many grew more dependent and financially insecure. Villages fed the system, yet famines and local strain exposed its fragility. The surface of order remained impressive, though underneath it the old certainties were beginning, very gradually, to shift. That shifting did not yet look like collapse. It looked, first, like discomfort, like a world whose categories still functioned, but less perfectly than before, like a household preserving honor while borrowing money, like a village meeting tax demands after a bad harvest, like a domain trying to reform finances without losing face, like a society that still spoke confidently in the language of rank even as money, print, urban pleasures, and selective outside knowledge were quietly rearranging the terms of everyday life. And it is precisely at that point, when the stereotypes are still intact on the surface, but the lived reality underneath them has grown more complicated, that the next layer of misunderstanding begins. Because the popular imagination often treats the end of feudal Japan as a sudden shock delivered from outside, when in fact many of the pressures that would matter most were already building within the world itself. Because the popular imagination often treats the end of feudal Japan as a sudden shock delivered from outside, when in fact many of the pressures that would matter most were already building within the world itself. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Tokugawa order still appeared, at least outwardly, stable. The great cities continued to function. Processions still moved along regulated roads. Domains still reported, recorded, and maintained their obligations. The language of hierarchy remained intact. A visitor observing only the surface might have seen a system that had achieved what so many earlier periods could not: long, sustained peace. But stability, especially prolonged stability, can produce its own forms of strain. One of the quietest yet most consequential of these strains was financial. The system that had once linked rice production to status and revenue no longer matched the increasingly complex monetary economy that had grown up around it. Samurai stipends were calculated in rice terms, but daily life, especially in cities, required money. Prices shifted, markets expanded, credit networks deepened, and many samurai, bound by status expectations yet constrained by fixed incomes, found themselves caught in a widening gap between what they were supposed to represent and what they could afford to sustain. Debt became a defining feature of life for many in the warrior class. It did not always appear dramatically. It often took the form of quiet borrowing, delayed payments, pawned items, or long-standing obligations to merchant houses. The irony deepened. A class that stood above merchants in official ideology increasingly depended on them in practice. The hierarchy held its form, but its internal balance was shifting in ways that could not easily be acknowledged without destabilizing the entire structure. Domains, too, faced mounting financial pressure. Maintaining retainers, fulfilling obligations to the shogunate, sustaining infrastructure, and managing the ceremonial demands of status all required resources. Some domains attempted reforms, reducing expenditures, encouraging agricultural expansion, promoting new industries, or tightening administrative control. These efforts could bring temporary relief, but they also revealed how much effort it took simply to keep the system functioning as it had before. And beyond finances, there was the question of knowledge. The Tokugawa state had long sought to regulate external influence, but curiosity could not be entirely contained. Through controlled channels, information about the wider world continued to enter Japan. Western astronomy, medicine, geography, and technology were studied selectively under the umbrella of Rangaku. Scholars translated texts, conducted experiments, and tried to understand systems that did not fit neatly within inherited frameworks. This was not a widespread transformation, but it was enough to introduce a subtle tension. The awareness that knowledge existed beyond the sanctioned boundaries, and that such knowledge might matter. At the same time, intellectual life within Japan itself was far from static. Confucian thought continued to shape official ideology, emphasizing order, hierarchy, and moral duty. But other currents moved alongside it. Nativist scholars explored ancient Japanese texts and traditions, sometimes seeking a purer cultural identity, distinct from foreign influences. Practical learning movements emphasized empirical observation and applied knowledge. Debates about governance, ethics, economy, and society did not disappear simply because the political order discouraged overt challenge. What begins to emerge is not a picture of a closed mind, but of a managed intellectual landscape in which ideas circulated, sometimes cautiously, sometimes quietly, but with real consequence. And then there were the recurring shocks that no administrative system could fully smooth over. Famine, for example, remained one of the most destabilizing forces in pre-modern societies, and Japan was no exception. Periods such as the Tenmei famine in the late 18th century exposed the vulnerability beneath the surface of order. Crop failures, harsh weather, and disruptions in distribution could lead to widespread suffering. Villages struggled. People migrated or resorted to desperate measures. Officials attempted relief, but resources were limited and responses uneven. These moments mattered because they revealed the limits of the system's ability to protect its population. A political order that depended on agricultural production could not easily absorb repeated failures in that production without strain. Famine was not only a humanitarian crisis, it was a structural one. Urban unrest also appeared from time to time, often tied to price increases, shortages, or perceived injustices. Crowds could gather. Storehouses might be attacked. Officials had to respond, sometimes with force, sometimes with concessions. Again, these events did not overturn the system, but they signaled that beneath the calm exterior there existed pressures that could surface unexpectedly. And still, through all of this, the symbols held. The samurai still wore their swords. The daimyo still governed their domains. The shogunate still issued directives. The social categories remained legible. If anything, the persistence of these symbols may have made the underlying changes harder to see. A society that continues to look ordered can conceal the extent to which it is adjusting internally. This is where the stereotype of sudden transformation becomes especially misleading. When change eventually comes, it rarely emerges from nowhere. It builds in layers, often quietly, often unevenly, until an external event interacts with internal conditions in a way that accelerates what was already underway. In the case of Japan, one of those external events would become iconic: the arrival of Western naval power in the mid-19th century. But to understand why that moment mattered so deeply, it helps to recognize that the society it encountered was not frozen. It was already under pressure, already negotiating tensions between old structures and new realities. When Commodore Perry's black ships appeared in 1853, they did not introduce the idea of the outside world to Japan. That world was already known, if selectively. What they introduced was a level of coercive presence that the existing system was not well designed to manage. The demand for opening ports, for diplomatic engagement, for trade under unequal conditions. These pressures struck at the mechanisms through which the Tokugawa state had maintained its balance. The response was not immediate collapse. It was uncertainty. Within the leadership there were debates. How should the country respond? Resist? Negotiate? Reform? Maintain existing structures? Adapt them? The answers were not obvious, and different domains, different officials, and different intellectual currents offered different solutions. The very act of debating these questions exposed cracks in the previously stable consensus. For the samurai, this moment carried particular weight. A class defined by service to a political order now faced the possibility that the order itself might change in ways that threatened its position. Some would become reformers, others conservatives, others radicals. The language of loyalty and duty remained, but its direction became less clear. Even the image of the warrior began to shift. The sword, so central to the stereotype, was now being measured against firearms, naval power, and industrial capability on a global scale. The gap between symbolic prestige and practical military effectiveness became harder to ignore. This was not merely a technological issue. It was a psychological one. A society that had defined itself through certain ideals now had to consider whether those ideals were sufficient in a changing world. And yet, even here, the transformation was not as immediate or uniform as later narratives might suggest. Many people continued their lives much as before. Villages still planted and harvested. Merchants still traded. Households still managed their internal affairs. The large structures of daily existence do not dissolve overnight, even when the political horizon begins to shift. What changes first is often perception. The awareness that the world is different from what one assumed, that the boundaries are not as firm, that the future may not resemble the past. This awareness can spread unevenly, touching some areas and leaving others relatively unchanged for a time. In Japan, that awareness began to circulate more widely as news of foreign demands, internal debates, and proposed reforms moved through networks of communication. Printed materials, letters, official notices, and informal conversations all played a role. The literate culture that had developed during the Tokugawa period now became a channel through which uncertainty itself could travel. People did not need to see foreign ships to know that something significant was happening. And with awareness came interpretation. Different groups understood the situation differently. Some saw foreign contact as a threat to be resisted. Others saw it as an opportunity to learn and strengthen the country. Some emphasized loyalty to the shogunate. Others began to look toward the emperor as a focal point for political renewal. Ideas that had existed in intellectual circles gained new urgency as they intersected with immediate political questions. This is where the earlier stereotypes, samurai, lord, subject, begin to blur in new ways. Individuals moved across expected roles. Alliances shifted. The language of tradition was invoked in arguments for change. The past was reinterpreted to justify different visions of the future. And through it all, the ordinary details of life continued to matter. A household still had to manage its finances even as the political order wavered. A village still had to organize its labor. A merchant still had to navigate credit and supply. The grand narrative of transformation rested on countless smaller acts of adjustment, decision, and endurance. The world of feudal Japan, so often presented as timeless and self-contained, was now unmistakably entering a period in which time itself seemed to move more quickly. Old categories remained visible, but they were no longer sufficient to explain everything that was happening. And as debates intensified, as pressures accumulated, and as the balance between continuity and change grew more delicate, the society found itself moving toward a moment where the familiar forms, samurai, daimyo, shogun, would be asked to adapt in ways that would test not only their authority, but their very reason for existing. And as debates intensified, as pressures accumulated, and as the balance between continuity and change grew more delicate, the society found itself moving toward a moment where the familiar forms, samurai, daimyo, shogun, would be asked to adapt in ways that would test not only their authority, but their very reason for existing. That testing did not begin in one dramatic instant. It unfolded through hesitation, partial measures, conflicting loyalties, and the increasingly difficult effort to preserve the appearance of order while order itself was being renegotiated. One of the reasons later memory simplifies the fall of feudal Japan is that the human mind prefers clear turning points. A ship arrives. A treaty is signed. A regime falls. But for the people living through it, the change was experienced less as a single break than as a series of unsettling recognitions. Old words still existed, yet they no longer settled arguments as easily as they once had. Authority still stood, yet it seemed less able to command confidence. Rituals still continued, but under them ran a new current of doubt. The Tokugawa shogunate's difficulty was not only that foreign powers had appeared with superior naval force. It was that the shogunate had been designed to manage a carefully balanced domestic order, not to respond quickly and decisively to a new international one. For more than 2 centuries, its strength had lain in regulation, predictability, hierarchy, and the prevention of large-scale conflict among domains. It excelled at limiting risk within a known world. The mid-19th century presented it with a world that was no longer known in the same way. This distinction matters because it shifts the story away from the lazy stereotype of a backward polity simply failing to understand modernity. The shogunate did understand danger. It understood that foreign intrusion threatened sovereignty, stability, and prestige. What it lacked was a smooth institutional path through the problem. Any concession could look like weakness. Any resistance could invite military disaster. Any attempt at reform risked empowering critics or unsettling long-standing balances among powerful domains. The government was not blind. It was constrained. And once we notice that, the emotional texture of the moment changes. Feudal Japan is often remembered as a world of stern certainties, but this was a period full of uncertainty among people who had been trained to preserve certainty. Officials deliberated. Domain leaders watched one another. Scholars argued. Younger samurai, especially those already frustrated by financial strain and limited prospects, found themselves drawn into larger political passions. The country did not simply split between old and new. It fragmented into competing understandings of what loyalty, order, and strength now required. The slogan that later became famous, Sano Joy, Revere the Emperor, Expel the Barbarians, captured one powerful strand of this moment. But slogans, however memorable, often compress complexities that were never so tidy in practice. Reverence for the emperor had deep cultural and political roots, yet the emperor had long stood apart from day-to-day rule under the Tokugawa arrangement. Now the imperial court in Kyoto began to acquire new political meaning, not because it had suddenly become powerful in a purely institutional sense, but because it could serve as a source of legitimacy against the shogunate. At the same time, Expel the Barbarians expressed real anger and urgency, Yet many of those who used the language of expulsion would eventually support selective Western learning, military modernization, and state reform. Hostility and imitation could coexist. That contradiction sits close to the heart of Japan's transition. The impulse to defend tradition often became the engine of transformation. Some of the domains that would later play central roles in dismantling the old order, most famously Satsuma and Choshu, did not begin as simple embodiments of progress. They were powerful feudal domains with their own interests, grievances, ambitions, and military traditions. Their opposition to the shogunate emerged through a mixture of ideological conviction, strategic calculation, and circumstance. Foreign threats exposed the weakness of the existing balance. Shogunal authority seemed less secure. Opportunities opened for domains willing to act more boldly. What followed was not a clean battle between feudalism and modernity, but an internal struggle over who would control the process of national survival. Even in this phase, the stereotypes remain tempting. One can easily imagine the old samurai world resisting change while enlightened modernizers carry the future forward. Yet many of the men pressing most forcefully for change were samurai themselves, shaped by the very order they were helping to break. They carried domain loyalties, warrior values, classical educations, and sharp awareness of status. Their radicalism did not arise outside feudal Japan. It arose from inside it. This is one of the deeper reversals in the whole story. The samurai, so often treated as static symbols of tradition, became among the principal agents of transformation. But that does not mean they ceased to be samurai in their own minds. Many understood reform not as betrayal but as a necessary reassertion of collective strength. If older structures could no longer protect the country, then preserving the essence of the polity might require changing its form. That line of reasoning helps explain why the political crisis of the 1850s and 1860s could become so intense. The issue was not only how to deal with foreign powers. It was who had the right to decide by what legitimacy and in whose name. The shogunate's compromises with Western states, especially through treaties widely viewed as unequal, damaged its prestige. Critics could now claim that the government had failed in one of its most basic duties. And because prestige was not decorative but structural in a hierarchical society, that damage spread widely. Confidence eroded. Criticism sharpened. Violence became more thinkable. Assassinations, factional struggles, punitive expeditions, and military confrontations followed. Yet even here, the atmosphere should not be imagined as one of uninterrupted chaos. Many people were still trying to preserve ordinary life within rapidly politicized conditions. Merchants continued business. Farmers continued work. Households continued to worry about marriage, inheritance, and survival. The crisis moved through society unevenly. In some places it was immediate and visible. In others it arrived first as rumor, then as administrative pressure, then as altered expectations. Meanwhile, foreign powers were not passive spectators. Their demands, commercial interests, and willingness to use force shaped the choices available to Japanese leaders. But it would be misleading to tell the story as though outsiders alone determined the outcome. External pressure mattered greatly, yet the form Japan's transformation took was decisively shaped by domestic political struggle. The collapse of the Tokugawa order was not simply imposed from abroad. It was worked out through internal conflict over how the country should be governed and defended. By the late 1860s, this conflict had reached a point where restoration, reform, and revolution began to overlap. The Meiji Restoration, later remembered with an air of clean inevitability, was in reality a layered and often improvised political reorganization. The emperor was restored to a central political position, but the men who acted in his name were frequently former samurai from powerful domains, and their project was at once conservative and transformative. They invoked imperial antiquity while building new institutions. They appealed to national unity while dismantling long-standing feudal arrangements. They claimed restoration, but much of what they constructed was unprecedented. Again, the stereotype of neat historical stages begins to fail. Feudal Japan did not simply end and modern Japan begin, like one lantern extinguished and another lit. For years, the forms overlapped. Old titles persisted beside new offices. Domain leaders became part of new state structures. Former samurai entered bureaucracies, armies, schools, and political movements. Local society adjusted by degrees, not all at once. The daily life of a village did not become modern in a week because a proclamation had been issued in the capital. Still, certain changes were profound enough to strike directly at the social imagination that had sustained feudal stereotypes for so long. The abolition of the domain system, the creation of prefectures, the gradual ending of hereditary stipends, and the weakening and eventual removal of class privileges all transformed the status order. The samurai, once visibly marked and structurally central, now faced a world in which their privileges would no longer be guaranteed in the same way. Some adapted, some prospered, some struggled, some rebelled, and many experienced a deep disorientation. It is difficult to overstate how psychologically significant that must have been. For generations, the hierarchy had not only distributed resources, it had organized meaning. It told people who they were, how they should behave, what forms of dignity were available to them, and how the world itself was supposed to look. To lose a stipend was serious. To lose a role was something deeper. This helps explain why modern memory clings so tightly to the last samurai image. It dramatizes a genuine historical pain, the erosion of a class identity that had shaped public life for centuries. But here too the familiar image misleads. The disappearance of samurai privilege was not simply a tragic sunset of noble warriors. It was also the removal of an increasingly strained hereditary order in which many samurai had already been financially insecure and politically divided. Some former samurai became leading figures in the new military, the civil service, education, journalism, and industry. Others found the transition humiliating. Some did both at different moments in their lives. And while the samurai struggle has drawn much of the attention, other groups were also navigating change. Peasants, now increasingly redefined as subjects of a more centralized nation-state, encountered new tax systems, new administrative demands, and new opportunities alongside new burdens. Merchants and entrepreneurs could find room to expand under changing economic conditions. Urban residents encountered fresh forms of consumption, technology, and political language. Women, though still constrained by powerful patriarchal structures, were living within a society whose institutions, schools, and legal frameworks were being remade in ways that would have long-term consequences. The ending of feudal Japan, then, was not only the ending of castles, swords, and domains. It was the reorganization of everyday life. But the old imagery survived, and this is crucial to understanding why stereotypes remain so powerful even now. The modern Japanese state, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, did not simply discard the symbolic capital of the feudal past. It reused and reframed it. Bushido could be reinterpreted. Samurai virtues could be nationalized. Loyalty, discipline, sacrifice, and martial memory could be attached to new institutions such as the conscript army and the modern school system. In that sense, feudal stereotypes did not die with feudalism. They were repurposed. That repurposing had enormous consequences. The samurai became less a living class than a moral image. The emperor became more than a distant court figure. He became the symbolic center of a modern state. Martial values could now be presented as timeless national character rather than historically specific class ideals. This process would help shape not only domestic identity but also how Japan presented itself to the world, and how the world, in turn, came to imagine Japan through a selectively polished past. It is one of history's more subtle ironies that the stereotypes many people now associate with old Japan are not purely old. Many were sharpened by modernity. Tourism, global exhibitions, print culture, photography, school textbooks, military ideology, novels, and later film all helped curate an image of the past. The geisha could stand for elegance, the samurai for honor, the ninja for mystery, the castle for national heritage, the tea ceremony for refinement. None of these associations was invented from nothing, but each was flattened by repetition. What had once belonged to specific institutions, regions, and historical conditions could now circulate as a package of cultural symbols. And foreign audiences were eager for that package. Western travelers, diplomats, collectors, and writers often approached Japan with their own appetites already prepared. For the exotic, the disciplined, the artistic, the ancient, the mysterious. They misread, simplified, admired, and rearranged what they saw. Some looked for authenticity in places where what they were seeing had already been staged, adapted, or commodified. Others projected fantasies of feminine delicacy, warrior purity, or national uniqueness onto a society that was far more contested and changing than they realized. This matters because stereotypes are never created by one side alone. They are co-produced. Domestic narratives, foreign desires, political uses, and commercial incentives all work together. Feudal Japan became, in part, a beautifully packaged memory because so many different people found that memory useful. Yet usefulness can distort. The geisha becomes an emblem and loses her labor. The samurai becomes a code and loses his debts, frustrations, and bureaucratic routine. The ninja becomes a costume and loses the plain clothes, the patience, and the ordinary disguises. The peasant becomes a bowed figure in a rice field and loses the village meeting, the petition, the negotiation, and the local knowledge. The daimyo becomes grandeur and loses fiscal anxiety. The tea ceremony becomes timeless serenity and loses the very historical processes through which it acquired its meanings. Even the phrase feudal Japan itself can flatten more than it reveals. It covers many centuries, many regional differences, many shifts in warfare, economy, culture, and government. It brings together eras that did not feel identical to the people living within them. A warrior in the Sengoku age, moving through a landscape of unstable alliances and military urgency, lived in a different emotional and political universe from a lower-ranking samurai official in late Tokugawa Edo, worrying over stipends, propriety, and the price of urban life. Yet modern shorthand often compresses them into one image because one image is easier to remember. That compression is precisely what this topic has been quietly resisting all along. The real fascination of feudal Japan does not lie in whether the stereotypes are wholly true or wholly false. It lies in the distance between symbol and system. Why did certain images survive? What needs did they satisfy? What realities did they conceal? The answer, more often than not, is that the symbols survived because they reduced complexity without eliminating all truth. They gave later generations something portable, an idea of order, mystery, discipline, beauty, and hierarchy. But portable ideas are rarely the same as lived worlds. And lived worlds are always messier. Think again of a samurai household in the late Tokugawa years. The room may still contain the signs of rank. The family line may still be recited. A sword may still hang in place. Yet behind that arrangement lie money problems, political uncertainty, aging parents, educational hopes for children, the pressure of reputation, and the rumor that the country itself is changing in ways no one can fully predict. That is not the disappearance of history beneath stereotype. It is history in its most recognizable human form. Or think of a merchant house in Osaka, prosperous but still navigating an official vocabulary that places warriors above it. Accounts are being checked. Credit relations extend outward. Taste is being refined. Goods move through networks. News arrives. The household is wealthy, disciplined, and socially alert. It belongs to a feudal world, yet it is already participating in forces that will outgrow that world. Or think of a village where harvests matter more than slogans, where local memory is long, where officials may change but the practical knowledge of water, weather, and soil remains the true basis of survival. The peasant stereotype cannot capture that world because it mistakes subordination for emptiness. These are the spaces where the most revealing history resides, not in the stereotype itself, but in the pressure it places on the things it cannot quite contain. By the time the old order had been formally dismantled, many of its social categories had already begun dissolving in practice, even where they remained powerful in imagination. That is why the end of feudal Japan produced both rupture and continuity. Institutions changed, identities lingered, symbols migrated into new uses, old words acquired new meanings. The past did not vanish. It settled into the foundations of the new state, the memory of the people, and the cultural images that would later travel around the world. And once those images began to travel globally, they took on another life entirely. They could be romantic, commercial, nationalist, critical, nostalgic, or playful. They could appear in museum displays, kabuki revivals, novels, school lessons, military rhetoric, travel posters, Hollywood films, and animated fantasies. Each retelling preserved something and discarded something else. Each repeated image made the stereotype more familiar and the underlying society a little harder to hear. Which is why, before going any further, it becomes worth lingering on a final complication inside the stereotype itself. Not all simplifications are equally misleading. Some conceal hardship behind beauty. Some conceal agency behind hierarchy. Some conceal change behind tradition. But some do something more subtle. They make the people of the past seem more certain of themselves than they really were. And feudal Japan, for all its rituals and formalities, was full of uncertainty. Moral uncertainty, social uncertainty, practical uncertainty, and eventually political uncertainty too. The quiet power of the stereotypes has always come from their confidence. The quiet power of history comes from restoring the doubt. And once that doubt returns, once we allow these famous figures to become contingent, adaptive, constrained, and sometimes unsure, the entire world of feudal Japan begins to feel less like a pageant and more like a society living through time. That change in perspective matters, especially when we turn from the symbols themselves to the legacy they left behind, because the afterlife of feudal Japan did not remain inside Japan alone. It shaped how the modern world imagined Japan, how Japan imagined its own past, and how these old stereotypes would be revived, challenged, and reinvented again and again in the centuries that followed. And how these old stereotypes would be revived, challenged, and reinvented again and again in the centuries that followed. That afterlife is part of the history, not an appendix to it. A stereotype does not simply hover above the past as an error waiting to be corrected. It becomes a historical force in its own right. Once an image hardens of the samurai as pure honor, of the ninja as hidden mastery, of the geisha as refined mystery, of feudal Japan itself as a world of perfect hierarchy and controlled beauty, it begins to shape what later generations notice, what they preserve, what they export, and even what they come to believe about themselves. In modern Japan, the remembered feudal past could be both burden and resource. It could be used to explain national character, to provide moral examples, to create heritage, to attract interest, and to smooth over the discomforts of rapid change. The faster the country industrialized and centralized, the more useful a curated past could become. It offered continuity. It suggested depth. It implied that modern strength rested on ancient virtues rather than recent improvisations. And that suggestion was politically valuable. This is one reason the samurai image became so potent after the samurai as a class had lost their old position. A living hereditary order is often complicated, divided, and inconvenient. A remembered one can be made exemplary. By the late 19th century, writers, educators, and public thinkers could present the samurai as embodiments of discipline, sacrifice, loyalty, and self-control, even though actual samurai history, as we have already seen, was full of debt, bureaucracy, compromise, and variation. The messiness of the class receded. The moral outline remained. That outline could then be attached to the nation itself. This was not merely nostalgia. It was a form of translation. Qualities once associated with a warrior elite could be reimagined as virtues for soldiers, students, bureaucrats, and citizens. The old distinction between class code and national ethics began to blur. Bushido, especially in modern interpretations, became less a description of what samurai had consistently done across centuries and more a language for what modern Japan wished to praise. In that sense, the stereotype became stronger precisely because it had been detached from the complicated people who originally carried it. A similar process happened with other images, though in different ways. The tea ceremony could be reframed as the essence of national refinement. Traditional arts could be elevated as proof of enduring cultural depth. Castle ruins and restored keeps could become sites of historical feeling, even when the structures themselves had passed through periods of neglect, destruction, rebuilding, or reinvention. The geisha, too, became part of a curated image of traditional Japan, sometimes domestically valued as cultural heritage, sometimes externally consumed as a timeless feminine icon. And the ninja, perhaps more than any other figure, became global by becoming less historical. The modern ninja is almost pure portability. He can be inserted into children's stories, martial arts fantasies, action films, toys, comic books, and international entertainment without much need for context. Stealth, secrecy, skill, and darkness are instantly legible across cultures. Yet the very ease with which the ninja travels tells us how far he has moved from the uncertain world of spies, scouts, infiltrators, and irregular wartime operators who existed in historically specific conditions. The stereotype survives because it is visually efficient. History, by contrast, is slower. This difference between portability and specificity helps explain why feudal Japan has proven so unusually durable in the global imagination. It offers symbols that are easy to recognize and emotionally satisfying to arrange. The sword, the castle, the kimono, the tea bowl, the assassin in shadow, the woman with careful hair and measured grace, the peasant bending in a field, the lord within his gate. Each image implies a whole world at a glance. That is precisely their power and precisely their danger. Because the more efficient the image, the more likely it is to conceal contradiction. And contradiction is everywhere in the actual record. Consider the geisha again. Outside Japan, and sometimes within romanticized discussions inside it, she has often been turned into a symbol of pure aesthetic continuity, a figure who seems to float untouched above ordinary history. Yet her world was shaped by urban economies, training systems, licensed districts, changing tastes, class performance, gendered expectation, and commercial realities. The image survives best when all that machinery disappears. Once it returns, the geisha becomes more interesting and less ornamental. She becomes a worker in a disciplined cultural economy, not just a symbol in white makeup. The same can be said of castles. Modern viewers often approach Japanese castles as though they were straightforward medieval survivals, fixed symbols of the warrior age. Yet many castles known today have complex histories of destruction, reconstruction, wartime damage, modern restoration, and heritage presentation. Even in their original form, they were not simply military structures. They were administrative centers, status displays, logistical hubs, and statements of political order. Their beauty was strategic. Their whiteness and elevation expressed more than taste. A castle looked impressive because it was meant to. That might seem obvious, but stereotypes often remove intention. They present forms as natural and timeless rather than historical and purposeful. A castle becomes traditional. A tea room becomes Japanese simplicity. A pair of swords becomes samurai spirit. Once those labels settle in, it becomes easy to forget that all of these things belong to particular historical worlds of taxation, labor, rank, resource extraction, discipline, and design. One of the most persistent misunderstandings created by these later images is the idea that feudal Japan was somehow more unified in spirit than it really was. The stereotypes imply seamlessness. They suggest a society in which values, appearances, and institutions all harmonized neatly. But the deeper one looks, the more patchwork the whole arrangement becomes. Regional differences mattered. Class interests diverged. Time periods changed dramatically. Ideals were debated. Daily realities were uneven. Even the supposedly timeless symbols acquired their meanings gradually and often through conflict. This is especially important when modern audiences speak of Japanese culture, as though the phrase can be carried backward unchanged into earlier centuries. The people of feudal Japan did not live inside a museum label. They lived through changing political arrangements, changing economic conditions, and changing understandings of themselves. What later becomes tradition was often still in formation. That is one reason the Tokugawa period is so central to the stereotype-making process. Extended peace allowed forms to stabilize, rituals to deepen, literature and visual culture to circulate, and social identities to become legible in repeatable ways. A war-torn society produces memory differently from a settled one. Under prolonged order, types become recognizable. The samurai can be stylized. The townsman can become a cultural figure. The pleasure quarter can acquire codified allure. The tea practitioner can become an exemplar of taste. The very conditions that made Tokugawa life more regulated also helped make it more representable. But representability is not the same as truth. It is only a beginning. If anything, the calm repetitiveness of the Tokugawa order may have made its contradictions easier to hide beneath polish. When a society is no longer consumed by civil war, its self-image often improves. It learns how to narrate itself. It develops preferred pictures, can turn strains into style. A lower-ranking samurai burdened by debt can still look impressive in formal dress. A tightly controlled pleasure quarter can still appear glamorous in woodblock prints. A society managing external restrictions can still imagine itself self-contained. Repetition makes the mask feel natural. And this leads to a quieter, more intimate question. Why do viewers, especially far removed from the period, find these stereotypes so attractive in the first place? Part of the answer is aesthetic. Feudal Japan has been mediated through extraordinarily compelling visual traditions and later reproductions of them. But aesthetics alone are not enough. The stereotypes also offer moral clarity, and modern life often hungers for moral clarity. The samurai promises duty. The ninja promises competence. The geisha promises cultivated composure. The village promises rootedness. The castle promises order. Even when these promises are inaccurate, they are emotionally legible. They seem to offer a world in which roles are clear and identity is externally supported. For viewers living in more anonymous, disenchanted, or bureaucratically diffuse modern societies, that kind of clarity has obvious appeal. Yet the appeal often depends on overlooking cost. Clear roles can be constraining. Visible hierarchy can be humiliating. Aesthetic discipline can conceal labor. Social stability can rest on exclusion and surveillance. Composure can be learned under pressure. The village can be intimate and unforgiving at once. Duty can mean obedience to an order that no longer serves you. Competence can be extracted from danger rather than freely chosen. Once those costs re-enter the picture, the stereotype does not simply disappear, but it loses its innocence. This is where history becomes especially valuable for a sleep-friendly documentary like this one, because the point is not to strip all charm from the past. It is to soften the hard edges of fantasy until a fuller, quieter reality can appear. Feudal Japan remains fascinating not because it confirms the stereotypes, and not because it refutes them absolutely, but because it keeps slipping between them. It is elegant and uncomfortable, ordered and strained, formal and improvisational, deeply hierarchical and constantly negotiating hierarchy, proud of continuity and full of change. That layered quality becomes even clearer when we notice how often the stereotypes contradict one another. The samurai stereotype emphasizes honor and visibility. The ninja stereotype celebrates secrecy and deception. The geisha stereotype suggests delicate refinement. The warlord stereotype suggests raw force. The peasant stereotype implies humble immobility. The merchant stereotype, when it appears at all, implies cunning accumulation. These figures can be assembled into a dramatic cast, but they do not form a coherent social explanation. They are fragments of different anxieties, fantasies, and historical memories. That incoherence is revealing. It suggests that what later generations want from feudal Japan is not a precise account, but a repertoire of meanings. People reach into the past and take what they need. One era wants noble warriors. Another wants mysterious assassins. Another wants pure aesthetics. Another wants a disciplined national tradition. Another wants a commercial fantasy of heritage. The same past is asked to supply all of these things, and so its images are endlessly trimmed, polished, and rearranged. The result is that feudal Japan is often encountered less as a period than as a vocabulary. A filmmaker might use it to symbolize tragic honor. A nationalist thinker might use it to symbolize continuity. A tourist industry might use it to symbolize elegance. A video game might use it to symbolize danger and mastery. A foreign admirer might use it to symbolize refinement lost in the modern West. A critic might use it to symbolize authoritarian hierarchy. None of these uses is entirely detached from history. None is sufficient either. And because these uses are so varied, the same stereotype can produce opposite emotional effects. The samurai may be admired as noble or condemned as violent. The geisha may be idealized as graceful or pitted as constrained. The ninja may be treated as a thrilling invention or a marker of misunderstood military practice. The Tokugawa order may be praised as stable or criticized as restrictive. What survives across all these different readings is not agreement, but recognizability. Recognizability is what popular memory rewards, which is why the more historically responsible approach is not simply to say that everything people think is wrong. That kind of posture tends to replace one simplification with another. A calmer and more useful approach is to ask, each time, what the stereotype preserves and what it erases. The samurai stereotype preserves the importance of warrior status, discipline, and symbolic honor, but erases administrative labor, economic strain, and internal variation. The ninja stereotype preserves the reality of espionage and irregular tactics, but erases ordinary disguises, mixed military practice, and later theatrical invention. The geisha stereotype preserves the connection to performance and refinement, but erases labor, training, professional structure, and historical specificity. The isolation stereotype preserves state restriction, but erases managed contact, selective learning, and intellectual curiosity. In that sense, the stereotype can sometimes be treated almost like an artifact. It tells us not only something distorted about the past, but something revealing about the later societies that keep repeating it. That is true outside Japan, and it is true inside Japan as well. The country's own relationship to its feudal past has never been singular. There has been pride, embarrassment, commodification, scholarly revision, artistic reuse, and political appropriation. Some traditions have been carefully preserved. Others have been reinvented. Some have been nationalized. Others localized. Some have been turned into tourism. Others into serious historical study. Feudal Japan is not one memory. It is a field of competing memories. And perhaps this is the most useful place to pause over a final expectation reversal. People often assume stereotypes survive because the truth was boring and the myth was exciting. But in the case of feudal Japan, the opposite is often closer to the mark. The truth is not less interesting than the stereotype. It is more interesting. It is more interesting because it contains friction. The samurai is more compelling when he is both honored and indebted. The geisha is more compelling when her elegance is revealed as disciplined labor. The ninja is more compelling when secrecy depends not on magic but on ordinariness. The Tokugawa state is more compelling when its serenity rests on careful surveillance and administrative effort. The castle is more compelling when it is political theater built in stone and timber. Complexity, when handled calmly, has its own form of retention. It keeps the mind listening because each familiar image opens into a less familiar structure. The listener comes expecting costumes and receives institutions. They come expecting legend and receive households. They come expecting timeless character and receive change across centuries. They come expecting certainty and receive people who, like people everywhere, were trying to make sense of systems larger than themselves. And this is where feudal Japan stops being merely picturesque. It becomes legible as a place where power had to be managed, where identities had to be performed, where beauty could coexist with exposure to cold and hunger, where status could conceal debt, where tradition could be invented while claiming antiquity, and where later generations would repeatedly turn these lived contradictions into polished cultural memory. If there is a lingering reason these stereotypes have endured so well, it may be because feudal Japan itself was unusually skilled at producing memorable surfaces. It arranged status visibly, cultivated ritual, it valued presentation, it encoded meaning into clothing, posture, architecture, objects, and gesture. Later artists, writers, officials, and foreign admirers inherited a world already rich in forms that looked as though they should mean something. And they did mean something. They simply never meant only one thing. So a sword is never just a sword. It is a weapon, a status marker, an inherited possession, a crafted object, a source of debt, a political symbol, a museum piece, a cinematic prop, and a global shorthand. A castle is never just a castle. A geisha is never just a geisha. A ninja is never just a ninja. Each has traveled too far through time, ideology, commerce, and imagination to remain simple. The work of careful history, then, is not to strip away every image until nothing remains. It is to let the image stay in view while gradually restoring the weight around it. To place the sword back into the hand of a man who may have spent more of his life reading accounts than drawing steel. To place the geisha back into the demanding circuits of apprenticeship and performance. To place the ninja back into the messy practicalities of intelligence gathering. To place the peasant back into the village assembly, the tax record, the weather-watching field. To place the daimyo back into the financial and ceremonial machinery that made his grandeur possible. Once that weight returns, the familiar world looks quieter, denser, and much more alive. And in that more alive world, another question begins to emerge, not just what feudal Japan really was, but why modern audiences remain so ready to mistake polished symbols for whole civilizations. and what that habit of looking says about the way we turn every distant past into something we can comfortably consume. And what that habit of looking says about the way we turn every distant past into something we can comfortably consume. It is a habit as old as historical memory itself. The farther away a society feels, the more easily it becomes decorative. Its uncertainties fade first, then its inconveniences, then the sheer density of ordinary life. What remains is a manageable arrangement of symbols. Recognizable, repeatable, emotionally efficient. Feudal Japan has suffered from this in a particularly vivid way because so much of its surviving imagery is genuinely beautiful, and beauty gives simplification a great advantage. A difficult reality, once arranged attractively enough, can begin to feel not only understandable, but reassuring. That reassurance is worth examining. For many modern viewers, the stereotypes of feudal Japan seem to promise a world that knew what it was. Not necessarily a kind world, or an equal one, but a world structured by visible forms. People appear to have had roles. Objects appear to have had meaning. Ritual appears to have governed uncertainty. In an age where institutions often feel impersonal and identities unstable, that older world can look strangely coherent. The samurai knows his duty. The geisha knows her art. The lord commands. The peasant labors. The ninja slips between categories without belonging to any of them. Even conflict seems stylized. But that coherence is largely retrospective. The actual people of feudal Japan did not wake each morning thinking that they were living inside an elegantly ordered historical tableau. They woke to weather money, illness, obligation, rank anxiety, deadlines, ceremonial expectations, and the possibility that the person above them or below them in the hierarchy might behave less predictably than the ideology suggested. A society can project coherence without fully possessing it. In fact, some societies project it most intensely when possessing it has become difficult. And this is one reason stereotypes can be so emotionally persuasive. They do not merely misrepresent the past. They answer needs in the present. The samurai, for example, is often admired not just because he belongs to Japan, but because he appears to belong to a moral universe in which sacrifice, loyalty, and discipline still matter publicly. Whether or not actual samurai life consistently resembled that universe is almost secondary to the emotional function the image now performs. It offers an antidote to drift. It offers the fantasy of obligation made honorable. It promises that identity can be both difficult and clear. The geisha performs a different function. She offers the fantasy that refinement can still be total, that conversation, dress, music, gesture, and timing can be cultivated to a degree modern hurried life rarely permits. The stereotype turns her into an emblem of composure. It invites admiration precisely because so many modern settings feel culturally flattened or rushed by comparison. The cost of that composure, the labor behind it, and the institutional constraints around it are then quietly pushed to the edges. The ninja answers yet another desire, the longing for hidden competence. In a world of bureaucracy and spectacle, the ninja represents mastery without display. He is the dream of skill detached from permission. He does not need rank to act. He requires no ceremony to matter. It is easy to see why such a figure flourishes in modern imagination. Yet it is also easy to see how little that dream depends on the actual conditions of intelligence gathering, local conflict, disguise, and irregular war in pre-modern Japan. This is why the stereotypes remain resilient even when corrected. They are not held in place by ignorance alone. They are held in place by usefulness. The same is true of the wider image of feudal Japan as a whole. It can be made to represent disciplined traditionalism, refined aesthetic life, martial virtue, spiritual order, or even a lost unity between beauty and structure. Different audiences take different things from it, but nearly all depend on some degree of flattening. The complexity of the period, its internal change, its economic contradictions, its regional variation, its layered political systems, interferes with symbolic consumption. Complexity slows down admiration. It makes viewers work harder. It denies the comfort of immediate recognition. Yet that slowing down is precisely where the most interesting history begins. Once we stop consuming feudal Japan as a set of stable icons, we begin to notice how often symbols and lived realities rubbed against one another. That friction is not a flaw in the history. It is the history. A samurai might speak in the language of inherited honor while quietly calculating debts. A merchant might outwardly defer to rank while privately understanding that credit extended leverage over men who ranked above him. A domain official might promote moral order while struggling to balance finances. A village might perform obedience while pursuing subtle strategies of survival and negotiation. A geisha might embody cultivated grace while navigating a commercial and social environment that demanded constant discipline. Each figure contained more than the stereotype could bear. There is also another reason modern people find it difficult to let go of these simplified images. They are reinforced by the way historical evidence itself reaches us. The past does not survive in equal proportions. It survives in documents, buildings, paintings, prints, literary texts, official codes, household records, travel accounts, and later reconstructions, all of which privilege some experiences over others. Formal life often leaves clearer traces than informal life. Elite anxieties are recorded more often than common fatigue. Aesthetic objects endure better than fleeting conversations. Regulations survive more readily than the quiet evasions those regulations produced. So even responsible history has to work against the grain of its own sources. When we read a domain code or a samurai moral treatise, we are hearing an idealized voice. When we admire a woodblock print, we are seeing a curated moment. When we visit a reconstructed castle, we are entering a heritage object shaped partly by modern priorities. When we encounter later accounts of Bushido, we are often reading interpretation layered onto interpretation. None of this makes the evidence useless. It simply means that the polished surface is not an accidental distortion added later. In many cases, it was already part of the original presentation. Feudal Japan knew how to represent itself. That may be one of the deepest reasons its stereotypes have traveled so effectively. Some societies leave behind fragments. Others leave behind forms. Japan, especially from the Tokugawa period onward, left behind an extraordinary abundance of formalized cultural material, visual, textual, ritual, architectural, that lends itself to being turned into emblem. The problem is not that these emblems are empty. It is that they are too full of condensed meaning. They arrive already shaped, and modern viewers often accept the shape before asking what pressures created it. Take etiquette, for example. One of the common impressions of feudal Japan is that it was governed by a uniquely intricate and pervasive code of politeness. There is truth here. Rank-conscious societies do tend to refine gesture, wording, and bodily presentation into elaborate social technologies. But etiquette was not merely an ornament of civility. It was a means of navigating danger, hierarchy, and ambiguity. The more unequal a society, the more consequential the small performances of deference, restraint, and propriety can become. In that sense, etiquette was practical before it was beautiful. A carefully timed bow, a proper form of address, the correct handling of a letter, the correct seating order, the management of silence. These things could prevent offense, preserve dignity, and keep relationships functioning. They were tools of social survival. To later observers, they might appear graceful and subtly charming. To those inside the system, they could also be exhausting. A mistake in form was not just embarrassing. It could have consequences. The stereotype remembers elegance. The lived experience often included vigilance. The same is true of clothing. Modern audiences tend to encounter historical Japanese dress aesthetically, as if garments existed chiefly to be admired. Yet clothing in feudal Japan was also regulation, climate response, cost burden, class marker, occupational signal, and seasonal code. Fabrics, colors, layering, and accessories could all communicate information about rank, occasion, region, or household means. Sumptuary regulations sought to control such signals, though never entirely successfully. A robe or sash might be beautiful, but it was also part of a language of social position. And like all social languages, it could be imitated, stretched, policed, and quietly subverted. This is where the stereotype of timeless tradition begins to fracture most usefully. Tradition was real, but it was not always passive inheritance. It often had to be maintained, enforced, rest-aged, and adapted. A household had to teach it. A school had to formalize it. An artisan had to produce it. An official might regulate it. A city might commercialize it. What later looks eternal may once have been a great deal of work. Even the famous quietness associated with old Japan deserves a second look. Popular imagination often casts the period in muted tones. Sliding doors, soft footfalls, measured voices, controlled gestures. And certainly there were spaces where restraint was cultivated deliberately. But cities were not silent. Markets were not silent. Workshops, roads, bathhouses, theaters, inns, ports, festival days, and busy streets were not silent. Children were not silent. Merchants bargaining were not silent. Construction, transport, and labor were not silent. The auditory stereotype, like the visual one, selects one register of life and treats it as the whole. The theater is especially revealing here because it turns the problem almost inside out. Kabuki, puppet theater, storytelling traditions, and other forms of performance were not margins of the culture. They were lively parts of urban life and collective imagination. Yet the world commonly associated with feudal Japan in popular memory is oddly more hushed than theatrical. It is as though later viewers preferred the controlled image to the noisy one. And perhaps that preference tells us something. We tend to preserve the past in tones that flatter our fantasies about it. Noise complicates beauty, so does commerce. There is a persistent tendency to remember feudal Japan as spiritually or morally ordered in a way that stands apart from modern commercial life. But Tokugawa urban culture was deeply commercial. Publishing, entertainment, fashion, dining, travel culture, gift exchange, artisan production, and luxury markets all formed part of an active economy of desire and display. Merchants were not an incidental presence. They were central to the circulation of goods, money, and taste. Town life was full of transactions. A world of codified status was also a world of purchasing decisions. And this creates one of the most interesting undercurrents in the entire subject, the relationship between moral order and market reality. Official ideology might praise agricultural production, frugality, and social stability while viewing commercial culture with suspicion. But urban life kept generating pleasures, styles, and aspirations that were difficult to contain. The so-called floating world was not simply a poetic abstraction. It was a social fact, a realm of performance, consumption, fleeting entertainment, and crafted appearance that both reflected and complicated the larger order. This means that feudal Japan was not merely a civilization of stern discipline. It was also a civilization of appetite, managed appetite, stylized appetite, sometimes moralized against, but clearly present. That appetite could be for food, fashion, books, theater, travel, companionship, prestige goods, or subtle markers of cultivated taste. The stereotype of austere restraint captures only one side of the era. The other side smiles, shops, gossips, and spends. And of course, once appetite enters the picture, so does anxiety about decadence. Moral criticism of luxury, idleness, display, and corruption appears again and again in historical societies for a reason. It reflects not only idealism, but unease about change. In Tokugawa Japan, as in many other places, periods of apparent order produced complaints that order was being softened by comfort. Warriors were said to have become less martial. Town life was said to encourage frivolity. Merchants were said to have grown too influential. These complaints may sound familiar because they belong to a broader historical pattern. Stability creates prosperity, prosperity creates new habits, and new habits provoke arguments about decline, which is another reason the stereotype of timeless feudal essence is misleading. The period was filled with internal critiques of itself. People did not simply inhabit their roles. They argued about what those roles had become. That point returns us to a useful kind of humility when dealing with the past. Modern audiences often imagine that they are the ones penetrating illusion, while people in earlier periods lived inside unquestioned structures. Yet many people in feudal Japan were already reflecting on hypocrisy, softness, corruption, false appearances, and the gap between ideal and practice. They too noticed that status did not always align with virtue, that ceremonial language could disguise practical weakness, that codes could be invoked selectively, that luxury could coexist with moral posturing. In other words, they were not naive inhabitants of stereotype. They were participants in a world already aware of its own inconsistencies. The difference is that later generations turned those inconsistencies into cleaner images. That cleaning process did not happen all at once, and it did not happen only through propaganda or tourism. It also happened through education, through literary canon formation, through the preservation of certain arts over others, through the rebuilding of selected sites, through the romantic preferences of foreign collectors, through translation choices, and through the simple repetition of what was easiest to explain. Over time, the period became increasingly legible through a narrow band of representative forms. The danger of this is not merely misunderstanding Japan. It is misunderstanding how history works more generally. Once we grow used to seeing a civilization through emblematic fragments, we can begin to imagine that the emblem was the civilization. And then all the smaller, stranger, more human details, cold rooms, delayed payments, village petitions, apprenticeship fatigue, urban crowding, uncertain loyalties, slip out of frame. But those details are where real continuity lives. A child learning to bow correctly, a widow trying to preserve a household, a retainer calculating how far a stipend will stretch, a bookseller arranging copies for sale, a villager worrying over flood damage, a domain clerk copying figures late into the evening, a performer rehearsing to make elegance appear effortless. These people carry history more fully than the stereotype ever can. They remind us that a civilization is not made of its most exportable images. It is made of repetition, management, adaptation, and all the quiet acts by which people keep a world going even when the official picture no longer fully matches the ground beneath it. And in feudal Japan, perhaps more than in many past societies, that official picture was unusually strong. Could survive political change, could survive class dissolution, could survive industrialization, could survive foreign fascination, could even survive contradiction. That endurance is impressive, but it should not make us passive before it. The more patient way of looking is to let the picture remain, but keep asking what is just outside it. What labor made that elegance possible? What fear accompanied that discipline? What money supported that ritual? What institutions taught that composure? What compromises lurked beneath that honor? What weather entered that house? What hunger waited behind that tax record? What political need polished that code into something portable enough for posterity? Once those questions become habitual, feudal Japan begins to change shape again. It no longer appears as a sealed box of familiar types, but as a society of shifting scales: individual, household, village, domain, city, state, each pressing on the others. Symbols still matter, but they are no longer free-floating. They become anchored in practical worlds. And it is at that point, once the polished images have been returned to the dense texture of lived reality, that another problem comes into view. Because stereotypes do not only simplify old societies, they also decide which parts of change we notice and which parts we overlook when one world slowly becomes another. Because stereotypes do not only simplify old societies, they also decide which parts of change we notice and which parts we overlook when one world slowly becomes another. In the case of feudal Japan, that matters enormously because the most famous images of the period are so visually stable that they can make historical change itself seem less important than it was. The sword looks unchanged. The castle remains on the hill. The robe folds in familiar lines. The gate still frames the street. The tea bowl still rests in the hand. If the symbols remain recognizable, the mind is tempted to imagine continuity where there was, in fact, constant adjustment. We start to think the society endured as an essence, when what really endured was a carefully maintained language of forms. And forms can survive even when the world beneath them has altered profoundly. A samurai in the late Tokugawa years could look, from a distance, like a descendant of an earlier warrior age. Yet his daily life might have far more in common with that of a pressured official than with a battlefield retainer of the Sengoku period. He might spend more time on documents than on martial training. He might worry more about indebtedness, household management, and the correct performance of rank than about combat. The swords at his side remained real, but their function had shifted. Their presence continued to signify status, yet the society in which that status operated had become more administrative, more urban, and in many ways more textual. This is one of the quietest but most revealing transformations in feudal Japan: the movement from war as a structuring condition to order as a structuring condition. The earlier warrior age had demanded mobility, tactical responsiveness, alliance-making, and violence on a scale that gave different meaning to service. The long Tokugawa peace did not erase warrior identity, but it redirected it. A class originally justified by military necessity had to be sustained in an environment where military necessity was less frequently visible. The answer was not to abolish the class, but to moralize it, ritualize it, and bureaucratize it. The stereotype remembers the moralization. History must also remember the bureaucratization. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Castle towns remained castle towns, yet many increasingly functioned not only as military centers, but as administrative capitals, consumption hubs, and spatial expressions of rank. Roads continued to host processions, but those processions were as much about surveillance and symbolic order as about defense. Villages still grew rice and paid taxes, yet they did so within expanding networks of record-keeping, market exchange, and state oversight. The pleasure quarters remained marked spaces of licensed entertainment, but they also became engines of urban culture, fashion, and representation. In other words, many of the familiar surfaces stayed in place while their internal logic evolved. This is where the stereotype of timeless feudal life becomes especially unhelpful, because it encourages us to treat the period as static until the moment of dramatic external impact. But internal development had been underway for centuries. Urbanization changed habits. Literacy changed expectations. Commercialization changed relationships. Administrative growth changed how power worked. Intellectual exchange changed what could be imagined. Even the discipline of everyday conduct was shaped by these changes. Etiquette in a dense urban society carries different pressures from etiquette in a fragmented war zone. The gesture may look similar, The social world surrounding it is not. A useful way to think about this is to imagine feudal Japan not as a single scene, but as a long sequence of rooms. Some are lit by warfare, some by regulation, some by commercial brightness, some by household anxiety, some by scholarly argument, some by later memory. The trouble with stereotypes is that they flatten all the rooms into one painted panel. It is an elegant panel, but it cannot convey movement between spaces. And movement is what makes history breathe. Consider travel. One popular image of old Japan is of a society rooted in place, orderly and contained, with people living largely inside fixed local worlds. Yet travel, though regulated, mattered deeply. Daimyo processions along the great roads were grand and compulsory. Pilgrimages carried religious and social significance. Merchants, messengers, craftsmen, performers, officials, and ordinary travelers moved through networks of inns, checkpoints, post stations, and commercial routes. Travel literature and guidebooks flourished. Famous places became objects of desire and recognition. To move was not to stand outside the order. It was often to participate in it more fully. That movement altered perception, connected regions, circulated tastes, spread information, created shared cultural reference points. A society of roads is not a society of perfect stillness. The stereotype of feudal rootedness preserves something about hierarchy and regulation, but it misses the practical and imaginative significance of circulation. The same can be said of information itself. A great many simplified accounts still speak as though pre-modern societies lived in an almost dreamlike slowness, insulated from rapid awareness. Yet Tokugawa Japan possessed dense channels of communication for its time. News moved through official channels, commercial networks, gossip, letters, notices, publishers, and travelers. Information did not move instantly, but it moved enough to shape markets, politics, urban excitement, and collective anxiety. A rumor about a reform, a fire, a grain shortage, a scandal, or a foreign development could ripple outward in ways that mattered materially. This is another place where modern viewers can unconsciously patronize the past. We imagine that because communication was slower than ours, people lived in ignorance rather than in a different rhythm of knowledge. But different rhythm does not mean absence. It means a different texture of anticipation, delay, verification, and uncertainty. And uncertainty, as we have seen, was everywhere in feudal Japan despite the strength of its formal surfaces. Perhaps nowhere is that clearer than in the relationship between law and practice. Feudal Japan is often imagined as rigidly regulated, and in many respects it was. Status distinctions were codified. Swords were restricted by class. Domains enforced rules. Sumptuary regulations attempted to discipline display. Households were shaped by formal expectations. Licensed quarters were bounded. Religious institutions were monitored. Yet law in any historical society is only one layer of reality. People evade, negotiate, reinterpret, and selectively apply rules. Officials, too, vary in zeal, ability, and interest. This is not a sign that the system was meaningless. On the contrary, it shows that it was alive enough to require constant adjustment. A clothing restriction matters because people are tempted to dress beyond their station. A prohibition on mobility matters because people seek mobility. A moral code matters because conduct deviates from it. A hierarchy requires policing because hierarchy is never entirely self-enforcing. Once we recognize this, the feudal order stops looking like a naturally stable pyramid and starts looking more like a structure of repeated effort. It held often impressively, but it held through work. That phrase, through work, deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of feudal Japan. Too much popular memory is organized around status and symbol, too little around labor. Yet labor was the substance beneath every admired form. Rice fields had to be maintained, roads repaired, castle walls inspected, roofs red-hatched, textiles woven, paper made, tools forged, ledgers copied, meals cooked, children trained, entertainments rehearsed, ceremonies prepared. If the world appeared ordered, it was because countless people labored to keep it that way. And labor, especially repetitive labor, has a way of humbling stereotypes. The samurai becomes less a mythic warrior once we imagine the hours spent waiting, recording, studying, accompanying, and presenting. The geisha becomes less a floating symbol once we imagine training, memorization, bodily discipline, scheduling, and the requirement to make cultivated interaction seem effortless. The peasant becomes less anonymous once we imagine irrigation maintenance, seasonal timing, family coordination, tax calculation, and vulnerability to weather. The merchant becomes less abstract once we imagine inventories, risk, transport, credit, trust, and the daily negotiation between status inferiority and practical importance. Even the ninja, perhaps the most unreal figure in popular imagination, becomes more historically plausible once translated back into labor. Watching, listening, traveling, blending, waiting, reporting, not magic but work, not legend, at least not initially, but task. This return to labor also helps explain why the afterlife of feudal Japan has so often preferred elegance to strain. Labor is hard to romanticize unless it becomes either picturesque or heroic. Much of the labor that sustained the society was neither. It was simply necessary, and necessity is rarely what later memory chooses first. Later memory chooses what can symbolize. It chooses the sword, not the account book, the tea room, not the firewood, the lacquered armor, not the repair of sandals, the castle silhouette, not the labor draft that supported the domain. Yet if we omit necessity, we also omit causation. A great deal of what later appears as culture was inseparable from material limits. Architecture responded to climate, available resources, fire risk, social form, and inherited building traditions. Diet responded to agriculture, region, trade, taxation, and status. Clothing responded to production systems, regulation, and local conditions. Household structure responded to inheritance pressures and survival needs. Even ideas of refinement were partly shaped by economies of scarcity, repetition, and attention. Minimalism, where it existed, was not always a philosophical abstraction. Sometimes it was what could be maintained, or what had been made meaningful within limits. This is one reason historical empathy matters so much when dealing with feudal Japan. Without it, the period is either romanticized into aesthetic stillness or judged crudely from a distance. But historical empathy asks a different question. Given the constraints people faced, why did this way of living make sense to them, and how did they move within it without ever fully controlling it? That question softens certainty. It lets the past remain strange without turning it into spectacle. Take arranged marriage. To the modern imagination, it can appear simply as personal constraint imposed by family or class. And often it was constraining. Yet in a world where household continuity, alliance, labor stability, inheritance, and reputation were tightly interwoven, marriage could not be treated purely as an individual emotional matter. That does not make the system fair. It explains the logic inside which it operated. Once again, stereotype pushes toward either charm or condemnation. History asks about structure. Or take adoption, especially adult adoption in mercantile and samurai households. Modern audiences often register this as unusual, perhaps even as a curiosity of Japanese tradition. But within the logic of the IE, it becomes intelligible. If the survival of the house mattered more than sentimental attachment to bloodline alone, Then securing a capable heir by adoption was not an eccentric choice. It was practical continuity. A society can seem rigid in one respect and flexible in another, precisely because it is trying to preserve a larger form. That kind of flexibility inside form appears repeatedly. Villages might petition collectively. Domains might experiment with reforms. Households might adopt, rearrange roles, or strategize around status. Merchants might behave with formal deference while exercising financial leverage. The system was never shapeless, but neither was it dead. It bent in order not to break. And sometimes that bending is exactly what later stereotypes erase, because flexibility does not photograph as neatly as rule. The same is true of emotion. Feudal Japan is often imagined as emotionally restrained to an almost impossible degree, as though composure were complete and inner life neatly subordinated to form. But historical people do not cease feeling because etiquette is strong. They feel through etiquette, around it, against it, and sometimes because of it. Grief, anger, resentment, affection, ambition, shame, longing, and exhaustion are all present in the record, even if not always in the loud registers modern media prefers. A society rich in ceremony may train emotional expression carefully, but that is not the same as abolishing emotion. If anything, restraint can intensify feeling by forcing it into narrower channels. Letters, memoirs, poetry, household records, legal disputes, and anecdotal literature all hint at this. Beneath the formal world were private frictions, disappointments, attachments, and anxieties. A younger son without an obvious place. A widow managing vulnerability. A retainer humiliated by reduced means. A daughter moved for household strategy. A village leader caught between official demand and local desperation. A performer depending on cultivated poise while navigating a precarious profession. These are not dramatic inventions added for narrative richness. They are the kinds of tensions any complex society produces, and feudal Japan was very much a complex society. That complexity also helps explain why the end of the old order, when it came, did not simply destroy the past. Translated it. Many habits of discipline, many aesthetic preferences, many institutional memories, and many symbolic languages survived by moving into new frames. This is another place where stereotypes can mislead. They encourage us to imagine historical epics as sealed compartments. But people carry forms forward. They adapt gestures, concepts, and values even as the larger structure changes around them. So the shift from feudal to modern Japan was not a matter of erasing one world and importing another. It was a layered reorganization in which older forms were repurposed, contested, and selectively preserved. The samurai ideal could be nationalized. Household discipline could intersect with modern education. Traditional arts could become heritage. Old regional identities could be subordinated to a new centralized state without disappearing completely. The very stereotypes that simplify feudal Japan today often reflect this process of translation from lived practice into curated memory. And curated memory always has winners and losers. Certain figures become emblematic. Others fade. High culture is often preserved more deliberately than ordinary hardship. Elite objects survive museums more easily than village improvisations. Famous cities and castles attract restoration. The anonymous labor that supported them recedes. Even in scholarship, attention has had to be fought for and widened over time to recover women's work, commoner experience, local negotiation, environmental pressures, and the sheer weight of daily material life. That recovery matters because it changes not only what we know, but what kind of questions we ask. Once feudal Japan is no longer taken merely as a stage for warriors and symbols, we begin asking about would supply, flood control, food distribution, urban sanitation, seasonal disease, educational access, legal consciousness, child labor, household debt, fire prevention, rural protest, servant life, and the politics of reputation. None of these questions destroy the familiar image. They deepen it until it becomes much harder to consume casually. And perhaps that is the real tension at the heart of the topic. Feudal Japan is easy to admire from afar and much harder to inhabit in the imagination once its ordinary constraints are restored. A castle is beautiful until one begins to think about obligations, surveillance, and extraction. A samurai is noble until one considers stipends, dependency, faction, and the weight of expected conduct. A geisha is graceful until one considers training, commercial structure, and gendered limits. A village is serene until one considers taxes, hunger, and weather. A tea room is peaceful until one remembers the labor, discipline, and cultural training that made its peace legible in the first place. And still, none of this requires cynicism. The past does not become less beautiful once complexity returns. It becomes less obedient to our needs. That is a different thing. Feudal Japan remains profoundly compelling precisely because its beauty was not imaginary. Its codes were not invented wholesale, and its symbols did matter deeply. What changes is our willingness to let those symbols coexist with burden, contingency, and change. That coexistence is the more truthful calm. Not the calm of fantasy, but the calm of patient looking. And once we begin looking that way, another shift becomes visible. The question is no longer simply whether stereotypes are accurate. It becomes a question of scale. What happens when a few striking symbols are asked to stand in for a society that was, at every level, much larger, more crowded, and more internally uneven than the symbols can possibly contain? And perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind by feudal Japan once the stereotypes begin to loosen. The world of the samurai, the ninja, the geisha, the daimyo, the village, the castle, and the tea room was never false. It was simply never complete. Each image preserves a real fragment of historical life. What misleads us is the temptation to let the fragment become the whole. The samurai was real, but so were his debts, his paperwork, his compromises, and the long peacetime years in which martial identity had to be justified without battle. The ninja was real enough in the sense that intelligence work, infiltration, and irregular tactics belonged to warfare, but later imagination dressed that reality in theatrical darkness until secrecy itself became a costume. The geisha was a real and highly skilled cultural professional, yet the stereotype flattened discipline into ornament and labor into atmosphere. The peasant was real, but never merely a bowed figure in a field. The daimyo was real, but grandeur always depended on administration, revenue, and performance. The castle was real, but it was not just beauty in stone and timber. It was power arranged to be seen. What history gives back, if we let it, is scale. It gives back the household behind the rank, the tax ledger behind the procession, the winter cold behind the elegant architecture, the village meeting behind the rice field, the merchant account behind the warrior's borrowed money, the apprenticeship behind the perfect gesture, the bureaucratic routine behind the sword. Once those layers return, feudal Japan becomes less like a stage set and more like what it actually was. A long, changing, deeply structured human society, full of beauty, discomfort, invention, hierarchy, aspiration, and doubt. And doubt matters here more than we often allow. The stereotypes endure because they seem certain. They present a world that appears to know itself. A world of visible rank, visible duty, visible refinement. But the people who lived there were not made of certainty. They worried over succession, money, weather, reputation, harvests, loyalty, reform, and survival. They adapted to systems they did not fully control. They worked within roles that could dignify them and confine them at the same time. They inherited forms whose meanings were already shifting. They lived, in other words, much as human beings always do, inside structures larger than themselves, trying to make a life that felt stable enough to bear. That is why the real history is more restful, in a strange way, than the polished myth. It asks less of us. It does not require us to admire blindly or reject loudly. It only asks that we look longer, that we allow the symbols to stay in view while listening for the quieter truths beneath them, that we remember a sword can be both weapon and burden, a ritual both beauty and discipline, a hierarchy both real and unstable, a tradition both inherited and repeatedly remade. Feudal Japan has been packaged for modern consumption so many times that it can seem almost impossible to recover as lived reality. Yet the lived reality is still there, waiting behind the familiar images. In the record of households trying to continue, in villages negotiating with authority, in cities growing noisy and commercial beneath formal order, in scholars debating ideas under a regulated state, in performers training until grace looked natural, in retainers discovering that honor and dependence could coexist uneasily, in the long shift from war to administration, and then from feudal rule to modern nationhood, without any clean break in human uncertainty. If there is one reason these stereotypes remain so powerful, it may be that they contain a promise modern people still find difficult to resist. The promise that identity once came with shape, that duty once came with clarity, that beauty once belonged to a stable world. But the fuller history suggests something gentler and perhaps more useful. Shape existed, yes, but it had to be maintained. Duty existed, but it was argued over, compromised, and repurposed. Beauty existed, but it rested on labor and scarcity as often as on serenity. Stability existed, but it was never as complete as it looked. The past was not simpler. It was simply farther away. And once that distance is treated with patience rather than fantasy, feudal Japan becomes something richer than stereotype and more durable than myth. It becomes a place where symbols mattered because life was difficult, where order mattered because disorder had been remembered, where refinement mattered because conditions were often rougher than the polished image admits, and where change kept arriving even when society tried hardest to present itself as enduring. That is why the old images still catch the eye. They were designed, in part, to catch it. They arranged rank, ritual, and meaning into visible form. Later generations preserved those forms because they seemed to offer a coherent civilization in miniature. But no civilization fits inside its most famous images. Not this one. Not any of them. So when we think of feudal Japan now, it may be worth holding the image for a moment longer before accepting it. The samurai standing in formal dress. The geisha entering the room. The castle above its walls. The village path in the late light. The figure in shadow thought to be a ninja. Let the image remain. But then let the weather in. Let the money problem in. Let the labor in. Let the paperwork, the hunger, the training, the negotiation, the imitation, the surveillance, the aspiration, and the doubt come in too. That is where the world becomes real. And once it becomes real, it becomes harder to consume carelessly and easier to understand with a little humility. The stereotypes do not vanish, but they soften. They become openings rather than conclusions. They stop telling us what feudal Japan was and start asking what kind of society could produce such powerful symbols while containing so much more than the symbols could say. That question, more than the stereotype itself, is what keeps the subject alive. And if there was one detail in all of this that surprised you most, or one part of feudal Japan that felt hardest to imagine living through, I would be curious to know. If you enjoy this kind of slow, careful history, there is more waiting here.